The problem of internally consistent systems. Pluralism, indestructibility, stickiness, management, and democracy, as featured in the Map Is Indestructible. Imagine that there was equally rational and true reasons to believe in Christianity, Judaism, Islam, atheism, Jainism, Sufism, scientism, and let's say 100 other ideologies and/or worldviews. Which ideology should we choose? More than likely, we would choose the ideology we were already most associated with, which would probably be deeply linked up with the community into which we were born. And choose might not be the right word. Rather, we more so just absorb the ideology of our environment, which doesn't mean the ideology is false, please note. Everyone, to some degree, absorbs a worldview. But let's pretend we were born behind Rawls' veil of ignorance and had no idea that ideologies even existed, that we didn't know the difference between secular and religious systems of belief, and that we at 18 showed up on a college campus and were completely and utterly free of any ideological leanings. And then suddenly we were presented with 100 ideologies that were all equally rational and plausible. How would we pick a story? Could we stick with not having an ideology? Such could still be an ideology, and furthermore, it seems impossible to never absorb a worldview at all. The Map Is Indestructible by O.G. Rose, the essay, argued that an ideology was entirely internally consistent to the point where, critically, even its incompleteness proved justified within the system, to incorporate Kurt Gödel. In other words, in an ideology, no essential contradictions are found, only apparent ones. And considering this, ideologies and/or maps are indestructible. All criticisms can be countered, avoided, and/or overturned. Thus, assuming Christianity, Islam, and atheism are all indeed true ideologies, which I think we have reason to believe considering how old they are and how much historic testing they have persevered through, relative to their assumptions and axioms, there is equally rational reason to be a Christian as there is to be a Muslim or an atheist. So why be one versus the other, or why stay in one as opposed to leave it? Will time and history help us deal with this problem? That's a question which deserves attention, but considering what Nassim Taleb told us in Antifragile, as the older a book is, the greater the likelihood it will be around in the future. So the older an ideology is, the greater the chance it is an indestructible map and/or really an ideology. Personally, after years studying the apologetics of various religions, I've come to think that at least the major religions of the world are all internally consistent systems. Though ultimately I've only read a very small percentage of all the books there are to read, please note. Somewhere in the mass canon of works written supporting Christianity, for example, there seems to be an answer to every objection. Rather, in C.S. Lewis, James K. Smith, Timothy Keller, N.T. Wright, St. Augustine, St. Aquinas, the apologetic response seems out there. It takes time to rationally conclude Christianity is an internally consistent system. Yes, and we also must take a pitch and risk, but ultimately this seems to be the case. Problematically, though, so is my experience with atheism, Hinduism, Islam. The systems are all internally consistent, and so has been my experience with conservatism, libertarianism, liberalism, Unitarianism, empiricism, Stoicism. The systems consist of no essential contradictions, even if entirely wrong. Well then, what are we to think? What are we doing when we do democracy? Is it more so a way of social and psychological management or distraction than it is debate and persuasion? Is unity and pluralism impossible? Is anyone rational for ascribing to any worldview? Or does the category of rational itself really apply to any of us? Let's put this another way. In my experience, I have no reason not to think that most worldviews are internally consistent as possible because reality is situational. And that leaves us with a number of severe problems that, if not addressed, pluralism could prove our downfall. And with a nod to Hegel, there's no going back from pluralism without dire consequence. Are we doomed? A little fable by Kafka? No exit? Perhaps. But perhaps it's rather that thinking plays a different role from what we have often thought. Section 1. We seem prodigious at ideology preservation and geniuses at figuring out how our ideologies are internally consistent. And thanks to this genius, we can experience ourselves questioning and examining our indestructible ideologies, and so have a reason for ourselves that we are critical thinkers and not ideological. We easily found our views internally consistent, a conclusion we can take as a testament to our genius, our willingness to be critical of our beliefs, and the legitimacy of our beliefs. And if others think differently from us, how could they? Our beliefs lack essential contradiction, yes? The others must not have examined themselves like we have. They must not be as responsible or educated. And they want political influence? Are we fools? Geniuses at creating internal consistencies. Perhaps it is no wonder the world is full of indestructible maps. But then again, perhaps the maps are indestructible because they are true. Can we say either way? Again, we are geniuses at ideology preservation, and this is perhaps why humans have been capable of creating so many worldviews that consist of no essential contradictions. Perhaps our greatest example of ideology preservation is our construction of ideologies that are indestructible. Then again, perhaps the ideologies are indestructible because they are true. We have equal reason to think the indestructibleness is evidence of mere ideological preservation as it is of truth being present. If it was possible to determine that the indestructibleness of Christianity was due to ideology preservation, while the indestructibleness of Islam was thanks to its actuality, we might gain a means for rationality to be justified in favoring Islam over Christianity. But this is unlikely. If it wasn't, a way to break this tie would have likely already emerged in history. Why are we geniuses at map making and ideology preservation? Perhaps because there is great incentive to avoid anxiety, confusion, unknowing the real and pitched risks, the latter of which is a possible problem and obstacle because of how rationality and thinking operate in of themselves. The very structure of rationality seems to entail this risk, which means that if we use rationality, we are at risk of various forms of auto-cannibalism. And yet, without rationality, it seems impossible for humans to function, distinct from animals, to use language, to coordinate the construction of cities. And so we must ask, how can we best live with this risky rationality? Well, by constructing an indestructible block that can help stop us from ending up in pitch and risks, suffering unending mental uncertainty and the like, and it is precisely an indestructible map which can best carry out this blocking function. A critical quality of an indestructible map is its internal consistency, for this is what keeps it from being deconstructed by rationality, and instead something which benefits from rationality, seeing as rationality might deconstruct everything else, while at the same time providing justification to the ideology, at least to itself, precisely in finding it internally consistent. And these are the critical stakes. What is internally consistent is that which rationality serves and defends, while what isn't so consistent is that which rationality deconstructs. But the dream of rationality deconstructing all maps except one of them to which everyone would then rationally assent to, the dream of autonomous rationality, the dream of the Enlightenment, has arguably proven false under global pluralism, precisely because the true isn't the rational. Rationality deconstructs many notions, unveiling them not to be maps, but not all of them. Perhaps we are left with, say, 22. But this is more than enough for the problem of internally consistent systems to prove significantly dire and a major concern of belonging again. Section 2. As some might call it, the rational life must always be situated within ideologies, which presents us with a few problems. If ideologies X, Y, and Z want to work together to find a middle ground, should the rationality of X, Y, or Z be employed? Or should a new rationality be used that emerges in combining X, Y, and Z? And if this was done, a new ideology would be created, W, and now a middle ground would have to be found between W, X, Y, and Z, on and on. This means of solving the problem would only expand it. Second, the space between ideologies X, Y, and Z, which rationality should I use to determine if I should enter into system X, Y, or Z? Being outside an ideology and yet to choose one, it would seem I lack any rationality to determine which ideology I should adopt. And if I choose the rationality of ideology X, this would of course bias me to pick ideology X. If I am in system X and thus bound to the rationality of X, how can I ever leave or meaningfully choose to believe in X? 4. If the rationality of system Y is better than the rationality of system X, how could those in X ever use rationality Y? It would seem they would be stuck with mediocrity, and not only that, those in X would be incapable of even realizing that rationality Y was better, lacking the very rationality needed for realizing the superiority of Y. Assuming rationalities can be better than others, whatever that means, which might not be the case, we'd likely have to take a pitch and risk to know. 5. If rationality is relative to truth, mustn't every rationality be circular? 6. When rationality finds our map internally consistent, we decide if this is evidence of our genius or something we need to critically think about, and rationality is poised by itself to see little evidence of critique. After all, what else is the internally consistent but that which shouldn't be critiqued? Evidence of entrapment could be evidence of justification, and so on. It would seem that if some objective rationality existed, it would be in the space between ideologies, but it is precisely the truths of ideologies that make rationality itself. Thus, objective rationality doesn't seem possible. However, this doesn't mean all rationalities are equally good, even if they are all equally likely true. Though, of course, then we must ask, how do we determine the good, to answer of which we seem stuck using the rationality of whatever ideology we have absorbed. Rationality cannot readily help us solve the problem of internally consistent systems, and in fact, rationality is at least partially to blame for why the problem is a problem in the first place, as will be expanded on in The Truism of the Rational by O.G. Rose. All right, but what about personal knowledge? Could that help? Distinct from social and communal empathy and or critical thinking, as we'll discuss, might personal knowledge and practice help us overcome the problem of internally consistent systems, which is to say the problem of indestructible maps? In our time, there has been an effort to overturn dualistic thought and help us think of knowing in new ways, and thinkers as varied as Heidegger, James K. Smith, Michel Planier, Julian Hart, Austin Farah, Nassim Taleb, and many more have contributed to this project. Heidegger suggests that we are not brains on sticks, but beings thrown into a world and groping around in the dark. Pure objectivity is a myth, and we rather know by feeling around. Dr. Smith argues that we think the way we do because of the best arguments we've heard, not because of the best arguments we've heard, but because of the best stories, and that what we love is who we are, not what we believe, because what we love is what shapes our habits. As explained well in Longing to Know by Meek, Michel Planier profoundly connects personal experience to the life of the mind, and as Meek puts it, knowing God is no different than knowing your auto mechanic or anything else in the world. As Dr. Wilson outlines in a different method, a different case, Austin Farah and Julian Hart point out that foundations for knowing are inseparable from the ontological situations which that knowing claims to participate in. In other words, no knowing is ultimately grounded in premises that are theologically or philosophically neutral or self-evident. The self-evident is always itself within a worldview, but this being the case in no way means the resulting knowledge is necessarily invalid. For Farah, entities are activities lacking form and or regularity of their own, which only appears when the entities' activities encounter one another. The world is composed of determining actions, and thus if the world is to be known, epistemology must not be based on an indirect conviction that things are the way they look, but on participation in the determining actions of the world, and appearance, an indication of the unfolding, suggesting Hegel. In his book Skin in the Game, Taleb attempts to tear down our traditional understanding of rationality and argue that we can only meaningfully discuss the rational as that which increases survival, risk management, and his arguments are rather convincing, even if I might want to stress unfolding versus mere survival or something. Regardless, the point is that there has been a profound effort to connect thinking with acting, which is to say there have been profound innovations in epistemology that have transformed how we understand knowing from something grounded in seeking objectivity to something that emerges out of and cannot be known outside of subjectivity and practice. But personally, I don't believe any of these innovations help us solve away the problem of internally consistent systems. In fact, I don't believe they even sidestep the problem. I could be wrong, and if so, I would be delighted, for an answer to the problem of internally consistent systems might be at hand, a problem that, considering pluralism, strikes me as dire. Practice is always oriented by ideas and always occurs in and is interpreted through an ideological lens. If I believe that the point of life is to increase beauty, then I will act in a manner that increases beauty, and when I succeed, I might both feel good and see evidence that I am correct because of my beliefs. I will not do what I would have done had I believed the point of life was to serve my country, and thus I will not bring unto me a world path in which I experience myself feeling good about serving my country and seeing evidence that I did what was right. I can only experience one world path at a time, and the path I end up traveling down will be dramatically shaped by my beliefs. At the same time as my beliefs will shape what I do will shape my beliefs, but all this transformation will be bracketed and contained by the world path I head down because of my beliefs practices. Down world path X, the possibilities of transformation will be different from those down world path Y, and thus, thanks to my beliefs practices, I will have set for myself a certain range of possibilities that my beliefs practices will not be able to transcend. Though I don't entirely shape myself particularly, I can influence myself generally. My beliefs practices are bound to the system in which my beliefs practices are oriented by and occur in. If I believe the true meaning of life is to increase beauty, I will believe in a manner that sends me down world paths which the possibilities available will be ranges that are extensions of my initial truth. Perhaps down path X, which leads to Y and Z, I will find in Z a way to transition from the truth, the point of life is beauty, to the point of life is goodness. But then the new premise will still be an extension of the first, because I came to think to it thanks to my first truth, which will continue to live on in my second truth. Through practice beliefs, I seem to have free range, but not freedom, which might overwhelm with anxiety. If in system X the best thing to do is increase beauty, then what increases beauty, even if it involves self-denial, is more rational. In system Y, the best thing to do might be to increase the realization of self-will, and in this system, what helps us realize our will, even if it decreases beauty, is most rational. Humans naturally think practice toward what they believe is most rational, and so the system people exist in will predestine the directionality of their thinking, acting in a manner that stays within range of the system's truth. They'll be able to move around, but not really escape, which we cannot even say is necessarily a bad thing, needing a system to even say such a thing. Modern innovations in epistemology have successfully shown that rationality is indivisible from practice. But this might only mean that practice can suffer the problem of internally consistent systems just as much as does rationality. The body and the mind are prisoners together. This doesn't mean that people thinking practices in system X, Y, or Z are wrong, only that practice can't help us necessarily determine if X entails truth more like actuality than Y or Z. Practice can't help us necessarily touch the ground either. Overall, this suggests that it is not given that modern advances in epistemology help us determine how to move between ideologies, only help explain how we exist and justify ourselves in an ideology. The advances could actually help justify ideologies, and in this way, modern advances in epistemology could contribute to the problem of internally consistent systems insomuch as they make the problem seem avoided. Advances in epistemology do not necessarily help us solve pluralism from devolving into chaos, only perhaps help rationally justify the state of pluralism for good and for bad through the body. Something else is needed, mainly the encounter. Is there really no solution to the problem of internally consistent systems? Well, let's say there was one. How would we find it? Perhaps there is only one ideology out there that is truly internally consistent and actual. The only way we could figure this out and solve our problem, as far as I can tell, is to investigate every ideology in the world, which strikes me as impossible. We would have to take pitching risks, potentially thousands of times over, with no guarantee of reaching bottom, and at the end of the day, perhaps we would deconstruct 2,000 ideologies, but 300 would still be left standing as internally consistent. The problem would shrink, but not go away. The professor and the madman by Simon Winchester in mind, the task could require assembling a team as expansive as the one which put together to assemble the Oxford English Dictionary, and even with thousands of people, the task could take 100 years. And if at the end of all that work a huge book was released with the findings, there would be no guarantee that the public would accept it. We are currently suffering the legitimization crisis Habermas warned us about, and by the time the book came out, authorities may very well have even less legitimacy. Looking at the truth, the public may dismiss it as propaganda. Thus, even if an answer existed to the problem, at the end of the day, there's no guarantee that the public could accept it. There would still be an element of management that would have to be employed. The answer wouldn't feel given, at least precisely because the problem itself destabilizes the stickiness of truths, and thus the very question would cause existential anxiety for the public, decreasing the likelihood that they would accept the answer. Overall, all this can help us understand why personal knowledge can help us what is thinking, but this realization alone cannot help us solve the problem of internally consistent systems. Rather, the inevitability of personal knowledge is precisely why the problem is one we must deal with in the first place. Ultimately, I don't think the problem can be really addressed by individuals at all. We must think environments, mediums, social environments, aesthetics, habits, and the like, as will be a focus of belonging again to 2. Section 3. Does this mean everyone is brainwashed? Perhaps in a sense, but that angle also offers a temptation. We might disqualify everyone and thinking itself, especially that with which we disagree. All of our brains are washed by our truths, but then there is no such thing as a brain that isn't so washed, which begs the question of what value the term brainwashed even offers. What we find is a problem that we might associate with issues that have arisen in quantum mechanics, at least according to Karl Popper, who wrote that the early interpretation of Heisenberg's implied that the particle had a sharp position and momentum, but owing to our interfering with it, we could never measure both sharply. Coherence and correspondence exist in conflict. Put another way, Popper wrote that the crisis in physics is essentially due to 2 things: the intrusion of subjectivism into physics and the victory of the idea that quantum theory has reached complete and final truth. So it goes with thinking. Rationality is always organized by a subjectively influenced truth, forming an ideology and or indestructible map, and this seems to be the final and complete truth of human knowledge. And that's our epistemology crisis, which we can associate with our crisis in physics, which I associate with the problem of internally consistent systems. Why is it that we often stay devoted and married to one worldview? If multiple systems are equally true and valid, why do we stick with one? Why couldn't rationality have us float in the space between ideological systems? Why do people continue to believe in worldview X and not often switch to Y, then Z, and so on? If ideologies are internally consistent systems, and ultimately it is just as rational and true, as far as we can know, to believe in X as it is to believe in Y, why do people keep believing in X? What keeps them there, believing? Obviously, truths have a way of keeping people attached. And of course, it's just easier to keep believing what you've always believed rather than change up your entire worldview and life. But is that all there is to it? As discussed and compelling by O.G. Rose, it seems to me that truths are sticky. Once we believe in one, it's like we're stuck to it, like a bug that has been tricked into landing on a bug trap. We can't pull away, which makes sense if all rationalities are ultimately practically predestined by their truths. I don't mean to use such a negative image, for it implies truths are trumps, but the metaphor conveys the stickiness I want to imply. What causes stickiness? Perhaps ideas themselves, or to touch on belonging again, perhaps sociological forces. Ideas themselves are impersonal and unmoving. Even if somehow true, it seems strange to suggest that they can be sticky more so than their stickiness come from communal and personal forces that organize around those truths. It doesn't seem so much that 2 + 2 = 4 has stickiness as it is the case that the fact that everyone agrees it is true creates a stickiness over the fact. The stickiness is created by the society, which then, in a sense, squirts it over the fact. For example, Christianity has been sticky in the West. Even when people encountered strong arguments against it, they kept believing. Arguably, no atheist philosopher has been as successful at converting believers away from the faith as has the phenomenon of pluralism itself, because arguments and rationality aren't responsible for the stickiness of a worldview, but rather more so the society and plausibility structures organized around it. If no society was organized around the most objectively true ideology in the world, perhaps it would have no stickiness. If society was most organized around the most objectively false ideology, it would be the stickiest ideology around. People have known worldviews are subjective, but not until more recently have worldviews, in my view, felt subjective and lost their stickiness. When philosophical arguments against religion were at their strongest, the religious landscape did not change. When religions have become diverse, they have become wider and arguably more beautiful, but also emptier. Considering this, it seems that the stickiness of a truth is not necessarily related to its validity, rationality, or the like, but rather due more to its societal context. And if it is true that religion hasn't declined until sociological forces have changed, provides evidence that ideologies are indeed internally consistent systems. Reasoning has been incapable of moving people en masse out of ideologies. It's been the loss of stickiness that has made all the difference, or at least for a time, until the failures of Gibbons fell back onto the presence of indestructible maps. Now religion seems back on the rise, at least a map-based form of it, which, though might be less sociological, time will tell, but maps, even if practically similar to Gibbons, might not prove able to provide belonging. What do we mean in saying Gibbons failed into indestructible maps? We're alluding to belonging again by O.G. Rose, where a given is something that's true to us, not because we've thought about it, but because it just is the way of the world, thoughtlessly thus. We have absorbed it sociologically. In the past, where Christianity was given, Christianity was true because it wasn't so much thought about. Today, where Christianity is an indestructible map, Christianity is true because its incompleteness can't be shown to necessarily falsify it. And furthermore, every other view is in the same boat, so we can't dispute Christianity on grounds that there are better options. Sure, our option to us is better than Christianity, but to the Christian, it doesn't have to be. And so everyone can be like that Burdian donkey, immobile and unable to make a choice, precisely because all choices are equally rational and complete, enough so by their own terms, which is a state of affairs that exists with memes, religions, worldviews, and so on, where everything is relatively frozen like that donkey, everything continues to survive, evolutionarily logical. But do they live? Perhaps. Perhaps not. To be clear, I don't think the stickiness of beliefs due to sociological forces like plausibility structures and Peter Berger is the only reason why we traditionally tend to stay in our worldviews. I think sociological givens might have actually helped us avoid facing the deeper reason why. Practically, givens and maps function similarly, but givens can help us avoid seeing the truths of our maps, which is their internal consistency, as we are suffering now, and is manifesting into conspiracies and so on. Maps can work enough like givens to make them function in their place and something to which people can readily turn, noticing little change. But though practically similar, there is a critical technical difference between thoughtless givens and indestructible, ergo inescapable maps, a difference that comes out more and more with time as Pandora's rationality multiplies, as we'll discuss, as time, history, and the internet tests views, as anxiety develops. Though practically identical, sociologically, there are differences between maps and givens that should be noted. Givens tend to generate thoughtlessness, while maps tend to generate anxiety. We know that maps, which we can overlap with scripts, cannot prove themselves, and yet their very internal consistency provides us reason to stick with them. But this relationship can be thought-tormented and anxious, alluding to The Dead by Joyce. Givens work precisely by stopping thought. But that is why manipulation is possible, and without something like either maps or givens, we run the risk of confronting the real, denying the relational and situational quality of reality, and ultimately proving dysfunctional. We are in danger, or we are no more. Section 4. I have already discussed why there is incentive to realize an indestructible map over a mere notion, because what is indestructible is a better guarantee for avoiding Pictian risks and existential anxiety. But another reason is because it is practically better to base civilization on an indestructible foundation than something more fragile. A destructible notion isn't as useful as an indestructible one, and so it is only a matter of basic existential and psychological incentives for us to test and find the indestructible maps around which we can then organize. It also makes sense practically because if we poured a lot of resources into building schools, governments, churches, community centers, and so on, which were based and justified by weak and destructible notions, we'd run the risk of having all our work undermined and deconstructed, as we'd also risk the loss of social cohesion, authoritative beliefs which might compel reproduction, ethical schemas that everyone shares, and so on. In this sense, it's smart and a good investment strategy to base our lives and civilizations on indestructible maps. And frankly, the civilizations and people who don't are likely to suffer significantly for it, providing further forces of natural ideological selection which favor determining indestructible maps. A house that is built on a bad foundation can suffer greatly for this mistake. Likewise, humans who construct and orbit their lives around fragile notions that aren't internally consistent are likely to pay a high price in the future. Hence, as history develops over time, it is likely that civilizations which last are constructed upon more indestructible maps than mere notions, and also find ways to avoid losing stickiness, say through insulation from the broader world, for good and for bad, even if there is a great nova effect in the civilizations where religions and philosophical expressions multiply and grow, as Charles Taylor discusses. Sure, there are arguably more ideologies today than ever, but my point would be that what civilizations, institutions, and the like are based on and justified by are increasingly likely through history to be indestructible maps, while in the past they perhaps were more likely to be based on notions which weren't internally consistent. Regardless, if there is a possible explosion of notions, ideologies, and the like, the main governments, countries, economic institutions, schools, and so on are likely to more gravitate around indestructible maps than others, whatever they might be. Earlier civilizations, perhaps not so much, but the longer humanity lasts, the greater the chance that our great powers be based on maps. And this means that the longer we last, the more likely it is we will have to face the problem of internally consistent systems, and do so through and between great powers. Our moment might be one in which history has transpired long enough that we can no longer avoid facing the problem of internally consistent systems. The saturation point, as Alex Ebert discusses, seems to have been reached. For existential and practical reasons, humans create notions, ideologies that then through time are historically selected for internal consistency, and the maps which pass this test are likely to arise and prove foundational to institutions, governments, and so on, for reasons of making the foundations of these entities as strong as possible, for assuring our foundations can help us avoid psychological turmoil encountering the real, for increasing the probability that a greater diversity of people can be included in the institution thanks to the very consistency of the ideologies, and so on. There are many benefits to realizing and organizing around indestructible maps. Furthermore, it is suggested that with time, the problem of internally consistent systems cannot be overlooked. We will have to learn to live with it, or else we will not belong again. And all this suggests that we must learn the art of faithful presence. Does this explain the Fermi paradox? Is the problem of internal consistent systems the great filter? The more time passes and history unfolds, the more the problem of internally consistent systems must be faced, which perhaps had to be faced at the point where no plausible deniability was left, precisely because we are masters of ideology preservations and can always avoid changing maps. Now, at this very moment, when we can glimpse that our map is indestructible, not necessarily because of its correctness, but because of its structure, is precisely the moment we might start to no longer be able to deny that a strategy of dealing with maps in which we try to deconstruct them is inadequate and unfitting for addressing global pluralism. This can be a moment of madness, but it can also be a moment of hope and change. We don't tend to change until we must, after all. Givens hit us from the always present problem of internally consistent systems, which glimpsing can help us understand how maps today practically function like givens in their absence, while at the same time are different qualitatively and in critical ways. Facing maps now, there is an opportunity for negation sublation, but that absolute choice will be up to us. Alfred Korobowski wrote how, in his book, Manhood of Humanity, it is shown that the canons of what we call civilization or civilizations are based on animalistic generalizations taken from the obvious facts of the lives of cows, horses, dogs, pigs, and applied to man. Due to these mistakes, we have been forced to develop under the unnatural for man semantic conditions imposed on them. In turn, they produce leaders afflicted with the old animalistic limitations. Animals can be territorial, violent, seeking of survival and social expense and the like. Where we are stuck trying to destroy indestructible maps under AA, we can revert to similar behaviors. This is the price of lacking a theory of sanity, yet it is precisely when the problem of internally consistent systems is no longer deniable and all hope seems lost that this theory might finally prove possible. Under Givens and failing to face maps, we have lived according to AA logic, which is an inadequate condition for the human subject, but it is precisely now when we seem to see that hope is lost that hope arises. Yes, what is increasingly vivid to us is a problem we cannot solve, but perhaps that doesn't mean there isn't hope, but that the problem is one to be managed instead. It can be. Well then, what should we do? Indeed, we have perhaps read a lot, debated ourselves, shifted our views here and there, but has our overall worldview changed that much? Has our initial reference point really shifted? Surely we've come nowhere close to equally studying all possible worldviews, and though we've perhaps tried to focus on practical outcomes versus intentions, employed falsification, tried to think through brilliant voices we disagreed with, and so on, it's unlikely these practices have entirely justified our choosing X worldview over equally consistent Y. Yes, accepting and justifying the essential limits of rationality and the problem of internally consistent systems can help me live with my intellectual shortcomings, precisely because I can tell myself that these shortcomings are unavoidable, as it is not my fault that I cannot fly. It is not my fault that I cannot equally consider all internally consistent systems. And yet, though I might understand this is the case, it easily still doesn't feel like I'm justified or that I'm being epistemologically moral. By definition, I never can feel justified. The loss of Givens necessarily entails the loss of existential stability. But can existential stability be regained through knowing that the loss of existential stability is inherent with the problem of consistent systems, and that the fact that my ideology is equally consistent with other ideologies doesn't mean that it is necessarily false? Well, what does it feel like? In conclusion and to review, globalization is a pluralistic world that through historic trial and error has helped sort maps from notions, moving maps increasingly toward the centers and foundations of societies. And in pluralistic societies interacting, that means maps are also interacting while surrounded by the multiplication of notions, maps, thanks to the internet. Since maps are indestructible yet aren't given, so can feel more destructible and chosen, especially the maps of others, these pluralistic interactions can be more psychological and anxious. In the past, when Givens interacted, I would wager there was an acknowledgement of difference, but not one that caused the same anxiety and existential doubt, for good and for bad, especially seeing as most of the interactions were economic, temporary, and military. Suffering this anxiety, relations could be threatened, yet at the same time it could be argued that diverse relationships are more possible today than ever before in history. With opportunity comes challenge. The loss of Givens might accelerate the process by which notions maps can be sorted into indestructible, consistent maps and destructible, inconsistent notions, meaning deconstructive processes like debates, skeptical examinations, and the like, which perhaps define intellectual life for most of history, have been made more efficient. But this could mean maps are rising to the top as the main intellectual challenge we need to consider, which intellectual technologies like debates, as traditionally understood, are inadequate for addressing, even though those technologies were historically necessary for us to arrive where we are today. Pluralistic globalization is where a major problem of ours is that the maps are interacting, and if all we have are the intellectual technologies of previous generations which cannot help us deal well with maps, then we are in trouble. All maps entail notions, but not all notions make up maps, and while notions compose ideologies, not all notions can quilt themselves with other notions into the consistency of an indestructible ideology. But it is also not self-evident which notions are which, meaning an experimental process of trial and error is needed, a process which must be ongoing given that new notions maps arise all the time, and a process that before the internet was increasingly slow and inefficient. For most of history, we have been dealing with notions maps within nations and usually under a general system of belief. For example, we have dealt with debating within America between Methodists and Baptists under Christianity. And for that problem, a slower process following traditional debate structures was, even if not great, adequate and manageable. Also, most of our concern, say under Christianity, was determining core beliefs like creeds, which were essential from more debatable and accidental topics like infant baptism, which made space for unity and difference all at one. Now our problem is the intersection of essential creeds per se, and how in the interaction can space for unity and difference be found. It was hard enough to find under Christianity within America. To accomplish the same between Christianity and Islam within America, let alone the world, is an entirely different matter. We need better social and political technologies, say the anti-debate of Jonathan Rowson or contradiction of Theory Underground, which the internet might afford, but isn't the internet also creating a mass spread of conspiracies and Pandora's rationality? Yes. Under global pluralism, where our main problem is not just sorting maps from notions, but the global interaction of indestructible maps between anxious people due to the loss of givens, which is occurring within and alongside a mass multiplication of maps notions thanks to the internet, that accompanying explosion of notions can perhaps make it seem like our main issue is deconstructing inconsistent falsities. But all of that, though a problem, is not for me the central problem, which is the rise and interaction of indestructible maps. This situation is what we need to think and innovate new mediums and expectations to address, from our politics all the way down to our schools. Debate perhaps was fine as a socio- and psycho-technology for dealing with ideas in the past, but in our age where our main problem is map interaction, we need new ways to bring ideas into interaction. This is the work of the liminal web, the social coordination system, a work of faithful presence, but this will be elaborated on in Belonging in 2.2, especially Book 4. Discomfort, uncertainty, existential anxiety. Is there any hope of escaping these feelings that haunt us today? Perhaps not. But if anxiety might empower us somehow, perhaps that's a good thing. Perhaps discomfort, uncertainty, and existential anxiety are good for us and will help us into humility and Nietzschean childhood. Perhaps, but these feelings could also drive us mad and into making totalitarianism appealing. It seems up to us to sublate these feelings more positively. Might our age ultimately prove blessed by anxiety? I've heard it countless times that the truth will set us free, and perhaps if I were to live 1,000,000 years and have time to deeply study every ideology, I would in the end find a truth that would set me free from doubts, unhappiness, uncertainty, and pain. But if that is not practically possible, can it be the truth? If not, is anxiety the truth? Will anxiety set us free? For more by OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth, and YouTube. You can find our books on Amazon. All purchases and reviews are deeply appreciated. And thank you so much for your time